Welcome to my talk about modern single sign-on. And in this talk, I will give insights into the security of single sign-on flows that are executed in pop-up windows and in IFrames. And you might have already noticed that this guy here wants to log in on booking.com here on the left and on pinterest.com on the right. And on booking.com, which is here, the login prompt is shown in like an overlay or a modal, which is basically an iframe. And on pinterest.com, which is here on the right, the login prompt is shown in a detached pop-up window. And so that's basically what we're going to look at today. Okay, so before we start, let me first introduce myself. So my name is Jannett, and I'm 24 years old. And I'm a PhD student at the Chair for Network and Data Security here at Ruhr University Bochum since May last year. And my research interests are basically threefolded. So I'm interested in everything related to single sign-on security and privacy, but I'm also interested in web security. And it turns out that this intersection here is especially interesting for me. And today we will also discuss like the implications of web security on modern single sign-on. Okay, so what's the roadmap for this talk? First, I will introduce single sign-on. Then I will present the standardized textbook flow. Next, I will explain what we define as modern single sign-on. Then I will discuss the security of modern single sign-on flows, followed by some examples of real-world vulnerabilities that we found in the wild. And after that, I will show a live demonstration of our tool, which basically allows us to analyze the security of modern single sign-on flows. And finally, I will summarize the lessons learned. Okay, so what is single sign-on? Well, you probably all know this problem where Alice wants to log in on several websites. And here Alice cares about security, so she has a different password on each website. So now Alice wants to authenticate on news.com, but unfortunately she forgot her password. So there are solutions to solve this problem like password managers or WebAuthn. And in the next talk we will also see like brainwave-based authentication, which also sounds like really exciting. But this talk is about single sign-on, right? And single sign-on can solve this issue here as well. And therefore, we introduce a trusted third party into the authentication flow. Here, this is a social network, so we can debate whether it is trusted or not. But in this case, Alice wants to log in on a website, and therefore she first authenticates. So she sends her password once to the social network, and then she can ask the social network to log her into the websites. Therefore, the social network generates a token, and this token basically contains Alice's identity. And now it sends this token to the websites. And the websites can finally verify the token to log Alice into her account. So in single sign-on, we call the social network the identity provider, and the websites are basically service providers. Okay, so how does the standardized textbook single sign-on flow look like? So here in the next few slides, we execute the textbook single sign-on flow on Adobe. So therefore, Alice opens Adobe's login page in her browser, which issues a GET request to Adobe, and Adobe returns the login page. And the login page contains typically a link or an anchor tag in this case here, which itself contains the Continue with Google button. This link is actually the login request, which is sent to Google. And the login request contains several parameters like the client ID, which in this case tells Google that Alice wants to authenticate on Adobe. The redirect URI parameter contains the URL to which Google should send the login response, and the response mode specifies how the login response should be sent to Adobe. And we will see later more on this parameter here. Okay, so now if Alice clicks on the Continue with Google button here, the login request is sent to Google. And now, since Alice signs in for the first time on Adobe, Google returns the consent page. And on this consent page, Google asks Alice whether Google is allowed to share her identity with Adobe. And therefore, the page again contains a button with a link, which is here, pointing to Google's consent endpoint. And if Alice has an account already on Adobe, then this step would be entirely skipped. Okay, so now Alice consents and clicks on the button, and now Google returns the login response as an HTTP redirect via Alice's browser to Adobe's redirect GUI endpoint. And this was specified earlier in the login request. So then Adobe can validate the token and finally return the session cookie, which effectively logs Alice into her account. Okay, so for us, the login response here is the most interesting part because it contains like the token, and if the token leaks to an attacker, then the attacker would probably be able to sign into Alice's account. Okay, so we've already seen the query response mode, but there are additional ones, such as the response mode fragment, which works like the query mode, but includes the token as the fragment of the URL, or the form post response mode, which includes the token in an auto-submitting HTML form that submits the token as a post request to the service provider's callback here. And we basically refer to all of them here as URL redirects, which are used in textbook single sign-on. Okay, so now let's talk about modern single sign-on. And in modern single sign-on, the single sign-on flows are executed in Popups or in IFrames. And here the flow on the left is executed in a pop-up window, which also then shows the consent page, so the login prompt, right? And if the flow is executed in an iframe, then refer to this as the iframe flow. So both flows here are not standardized, but they are heavily used in the wild, so that's why they are so interesting for us. Okay, so we looked at many real-world implementations, and we could find 4 common variants of the pop-up and iframe flow. And in the direct pop-up flow, the identity provider directly sends the token to the service provider. So this is just like the textbook case. Then there's the relay pop-up flow, and here the identity provider first sends the login response to the service provider, which then basically forwards it to itself. And the service provider here in the middle acts kind of like a relay, and we will see later the motivation for this. Then there's the seamless iframe flow, in which Alice already has granted the consent. So this allows the IDP to automatically return the login response to the service provider. So the service provider can automatically log in Alice. Okay, so then there's the interactive iframe flow, and here Alice has already granted the consent, has not yet granted the consent, and that's why the consent page is here shown in an iframe. So Alice has to click this button. Okay, both iframe flows here use direct communications just as the direct pop-up flow here. So the relay pop-up flow is an exception of this. Okay, so let's first look at the direct pop-up flow and iframe flows. So to start the flow, the service provider first either embeds the login request in an iframe or opens the login request in a pop-up, so depending on the flow. And now the IDP can generate the identity token and then return it directly to the service provider. So now we cannot use URL redirects for this purpose because the communication happens between different windows. Like in this case, it happens between the pop-up and the top-level window here. And that's why we must use in-browser communications for this token exchange. And because the identity provider and service provider are located on different origins, this communication must be cross-origin compatible in this case. Okay, so now let's investigate the communication on both sides. There are multiple cross-origin in-browser communication techniques, but the most popular one is basically the post-message API. And in post-message, the initiator, which is here the identity provider, can send data to the receiver here, which is the service provider, by calling the post-message function on the receiver's window object. And then the transferred data is passed as the first argument here, and the receiver's origin is included as the second argument. And now the receiver origin is like very important for security because it prevents other origins that are not webshot.com in this case from receiving the post message. So it basically protects the confidentiality of the post message. Okay, so the receiver registers a message event listener, which is invoked when the post message is received. Okay, before the post message is processed, for example, it is passed to some login function, its origin must be validated. So this ensures that the post message was sent by the expected initiator. So in this case, the identity provider. Okay, so basically the post message API relaxes here the same origin policy, which is why both checks here are essential for implementing post message securely. Okay, so now let's look at the special case with the relay pop-up flow. Again, the service provider here opens the login request in a pop-up window, and the identity provider generates the token again. But now the identity provider returns the token with a URL redirect to the service provider that now runs within the pop-up window. And from an IDP's perspective, this is just like the classic textbook flow. Okay, so the service provider in the pop-up then finally returns the token back to the service provider, now running in the top-level window here. And this again requires some form of in-browser communication. But in this case, same origin communication techniques work as well here, because the service provider communicates with itself. Okay, so now let's look at one such technique. In the simplest case here, the receiver registers a callback function that expects the token here as input parameter and then passes the token to a login function. And the initiator must just invoke this callback function and then pass the token as argument to it. So we call this technique JavaScript DOM access, and this is inherently protected by the same origin policy, so it is secure by design. So only the service provider can send the token in this case. Okay, so now let's investigate the security of modern single sign-on flows. We rely on the famous web attacker model, so the victim visits the malicious website, which is here attacker.com, and the malicious website then either embeds the vulnerable service provider or identity provider endpoint in an iframe, or it opens them in a pop-up window. And then the malicious website can send or receive cross messages to or from the iframe or pop-up window with cross-origin in-browser communication techniques, so like post-message. Okay, so now the web security threats, which are well known, meet the modern single sign-on flows. And we could find 3 common web security vulnerabilities in these modern single sign-on flows, which also have not yet been in the single sign-on community's focus. And the wildcard receiver and the malicious receiver both break here the confidentiality of the login response, which can result in token leaks. And the malicious initiator targets the authenticity of the login response, which can enable like token injections. Okay, so also we will shortly discuss the clickjacking threat in the interactive iframe flow. Okay, so in the wildcard receiver attack, the malicious website imitates to be the honest web shop. So here the attacker starts the single sign-on flow by opening the web shop's login request in the pop-up or iframe, and because the identity provider can successfully validate that here this webshop.com origin matches the client ID, so it matches the webshop, the IDP generates Alice's identity token for the webshop and returns it back to the attacker. So again, either directly or relayed depending on the flow. So the attacker receives the token due to this wildcard receiver here in the post message call, which basically allows all origins, including attacker.com, to receive this token. And then the attacker can use this token to sign in on webshop as Alice. Okay, so the malicious receiver attack works similarly, but now the attacker replaces the webshop's origin with his own origin. So now the identity provider here fails to validate that the attacker.com origin here does not match the webshop.com or the webshop's identity. So therefore, the identity provider again generates Alice's identity token and returns it to the attacker, either relayed or directly. And although postmessage is used securely here in this context, the receiver's origin is not verified in this case. So in principle, this attack would correspond to the insufficient redirect URI validation, which is already part of the security best practices, but in this case applied to modern single sign-on. Okay, so in the malicious initiator attack, we now swap the side. So now the attacker tries to imitate the identity provider to inject a token on the service provider. So therefore, the attacker first generates like his own token by authenticating on the webshop with the IDP. And then the attacker sends this token to the service provider. And now the service provider listens for this token in this message event handler here and starts to process it. But in this case, the service provider does not, or not properly, which is here the second case, validate the initiator's origin. So it does not verify whether the token was sent by the service provider, or sorry, by the identity provider. Okay, so within this single sign-on related event handler, we identified like 3 common vulnerabilities. The token could be processed like in dangerous JavaScript things, which the attacker can exploit to achieve DOM's cross-site scripting. So we've already seen that in the last talk. And then the service provider could also use the token to lock the victim into the attacker's account, which is also known as like session swapping. And the service provider could also use the token to bind Alice's identity on the service provider to the attacker's identity on the identity provider. So this is known as account linking. So the attacker can use his account on the identity provider to sign in on the service provider, and the attacker would effectively be logged into Alice's account. Okay, so this attack corresponds to cross-site request forgery in the security best practices, but again, this is here applied to modern single sign-on schemes. Okay, so now let's talk about clickjacking in the interactive iframe flow. And here we assume that booking.com offers like a 50% discount on its travels with this unlock instant savings of 50% button here. And now if if booking.com would turn malicious, then it could place the login iframe over this button and make it invisible. So now if Alice wants to click this button, she actually clicks the login button. So booking.com is able to secretly receive her identity. So the question now should be, how can the identity provider, here Google, prevent service providers from tricking their users into accepting the consent. And it turns out that this question is already well addressed in the security best practices, which suggests countermeasures like IFrame options or frame-busting JavaScript or the content security policy. But these countermeasures are disruptive. So they either allow the framing, optionally also for some whitelisted sites only, or they do not allow framing at all. So the better question would be here, how can we allow framing, but at the same time prevent click checking? So, and that's where the Intersection Observer version 2 API comes into play. And this API basically allows the iframe to track its visibility to a human. And therefore, the iframe creates this new intersection observer object here and listens for changes. And if a change occurs, it checks whether the isVisible attribute here has changed. And if the isVisible attribute returns true, then the iframe can safely enable the consent button. And if it returns false, the iframe should disable the consent button because it might not be visible to the user. Okay, so I've prepared a short demo now. And first, the iframe here is visible. And now the button is enabled, so the click is captured. Now I make the iframe like invisible, and the button is disabled. And if I make the iframe visible again, then the button is enabled and the click gets captured. So this API is basically a good starting point to implement the interactive iframe flow. Okay, so let's now look at some real-world vulnerabilities found in the wild. And I've prepared 3 examples on the slides. And later in the live demo, we will see another vulnerability which affects Alibaba.com. Okay, so Notion was affected by the wildcard receiver attack. And here the attacker could initiate the single sign-on login flow on Google for Notion. And then Google returned the login response back to Notion, which runs in the Popup. So this basically corresponds to the relayed Popup flow. Then Notion used postmessage to send the entire login response from Google, which was contained in the location href here, back to the opener window, which includes the attacker. However, in this case, Notion used the wildcard receiver, which now leaked the token to the attacker. So they did already include a to-do note here to set a proper origin, but probably they were not aware of the implications that the token would be leaked. Okay, so we reported this, and Notion fixed this with like hard-coded origins. So this is safe now. Okay, the malicious receiver attack affected cnet.com, zdnet.com, and some others. And to exploit this vulnerability, the attacker first has to embed CNET's proxy iframe on his malicious website. And this iframe exposes a JavaScript callback function, set credentials in this case, which relays the received credential with postmessage here to its parent. However, the receiver origin here of the postmessage call is taken from the XDME query parameter, and the attacker set this parameter to attacker.com. So the vulnerability is here that the iframe does not validate this query parameter. Okay, so to exploit this, the attacker can again initiate the single sign-on flow with Google. Google redirects the login response to CNET. Again, this is the relay pop-up flow. And now Google or CNET invokes the JavaScript callback here and passes the token as parameter to it. So this here works safely because both the iframe and pop-up here are on the same origin, and this is the same origin communication techniques, and they are safe. Okay, so but now the iframe proxies the token to its parent, so the attacker side, and this now leaks the token to the attacker. CNET fixed this by comparing the XCME parameter with a regular expression, which was unsafe in this case because it allowed all origins ending on .cnet.com to receive the post message. So if the attacker sets the XCME query parameter to attacker.com/.cnet.com, this would effectively bypass this check. So we again reported this, and they fixed it with another regular expression, which is like more complicated, but this is safe now. Okay, the last example, New York Times, was affected by the malicious initiator attack. And here the attacker first opens the login times login endpoint in a pop-up. And this pop-up, or this endpoint, expects to receive a post message which contains a redirect URI. And now once the single sign-on flow terminates, New York Times redirects to this redirect URI by setting the window location href. Also, New York Times checks whether the post message was sent from a New York Times domain with this isNewYorkTimes domain function here. However, this function always returned true, so they considered like all origins as New York Times domains. Okay, so the attacker can again exploit this by sending a special URL with the JavaScript protocol handler, which contains this JavaScript code here, to New York Times, and New York Times then assigns this URL to its location href, and this triggers the JavaScript code to be executed. Okay, so New York Times fixed this now by checking whether the initiator is one of these 3 whitelisted hosts here. Okay, so now let's move on to the live demo. And in the live demo, we will use a tool that we developed to analyze the security of this cross-origin and same-origin in-browser communication techniques in modern single sign-on flows. So we tracked them all and analyzed their security. And therefore, we will use the tool now to analyze and exploit the malicious receiver attack on Alibaba. Okay, so yeah. So I've prepared like 2 browsers. On the left side, we have the attacker's browser here in red. And on the right side, we have the victim's browser in yellow. And now the attacker first wants to like analyze the Alibaba's login flow, right? And therefore, the attacker uses this tool here. And we can start a new analysis run by entering the URL here. Then we can create a new handler, and now we need to execute the single sign-on flow. Therefore, we can start a browser. And now we can click on sign in here. And we will use the Google login in this case. So this opens the pop-up, so this might be a pop-up flow, right? And we already pre-configured the credentials, so they're automatically filled in. And now the in-browser communications are exchanged, and in the background, there's this Chrome extension here, which basically captures the in-browser communications and sends them to a backend, which then post-processes them and to analyze their security. Okay, so we should be now logged in on Alibaba. And now we captured like 1,600 in-browser communication. This because we also track same origin communications, and they are used like often. Okay, so we first can investigate like basic information about the single sign-on flow. So in this case, we see that the pop-up flow was executed. The identity provider was Google. The login request was sent in the pop-up, which was opened by the top-level window. Then we also see the login request URL here. And we also can see that the login response was also sent in the pop-up window. So this should be a relay pop-up flow. Okay, so now we implemented like a sequence diagram and a table view to investigate the in-browser communications. And the sequence diagram basically takes all communications, compiles them into an SVG, which is a sequence diagram, and then can display the communications over time and in the frame in which they were executed. So this can take some time. This is like really a large sequence diagram. Okay, so now we can see that Alibaba uses like several iframes. We also see the pop-up window here, which again embeds an iframe. And then we see these in-browser communications as these bubbles. Now if we scroll like down, we should somewhere hopefully see a post message that is sent between two windows. Okay, so now here we can see like some post messages which are sent from one window to another. And they are highlighted in red here because the receiver origin in this case is set to the wildcard. So the data would leak to an attacker, but in this case the data contains like no secrets or no privacy relevant information. So in this case this should be safe here. Okay, because this is so large and doesn't really allow us to filter the events, we also implemented the tables view, which also contains all in-browser communications. And now we can apply filters to them. So we can either specify like custom search queries here, or we can pick one of the pre-configured search queries. And now we want to check whether the pop-up window sent a post message. And therefore, we can select the show all post messages sent from pop-up option, and now receive like two post messages. So the first is not really interesting for us. It just contains this YouTube data here. But the second one seems here to be more interesting because it says like the action is login result, then there's a result code, and the ST parameter here is like this random value which looks like it could be a token. Okay, so it also highlights like related post message handlers which could process the post message. Then it highlights that the source frame, so the frame that sent the post message, is indeed the pop-up window, and the pop-up sent it to the top level window. Also, we see that the source origin here was not accessed, so this could probably mean that token injection works here as well. So now we want to see the JavaScript code that sent this post message, and therefore we can copy this parameter here, and now we have to filter for all the JavaScript code that is executed in the pop-up window. So we say hierarchy equals top pop-ups of 0. And the type of this in-browser communication is in this case document interactive. And the content HTML should contain this token. Okay, so now if we filter for this, we exactly get one match, which is like the HTML page that sent this token. And we can pretty print that. And now if we scroll through here, we can see that the token is included in this post message object here. And the response action here is also set to window. And now if we scroll further down, then we see that if the response action is set to window, then the pop-up registers a post message event listener. And if this is like the callback function, and the callback responds with a post message which contains the token and the origin of the post message that sent it. again, here, no origin checks are applied. So now if I'm attacker.com and I send a post message to Alibaba's pop-up, then Alibaba would respond with the token to me. Okay, so now we can exploit this by generating a proof of concept. And this basically takes all in-browser communications into account and sends them to the different frames. And because Alibaba uses like lots of post messages, this exploit is like really long. But for us, it was already deployed here on the server. And now the attacker would send this proof of concept to the victim. And now the victim would click on this button here. Now the single sign-on flow is executed. And the proof of concept did receive this parameter here in the ST, so the ST parameter. So now all what is left is that the attacker has to redeem this token. And therefore, there's like this, this URL where we can paste this token as get parameter. And now the attacker should be logged into Alice's account. Okay, so this is the case now, yeah? Okay, so we reported this like 2 years ago, but it seems like it still works. So. Okay, so what are the lessons learned? Modern single sign-on flows use in-browser communications, which replace the URL redirects in the textbook single sign-on flow. So this now brings more web security threats into the single sign-on domain, and we should treat them carefully. And we've seen both same-origin and cross-origin techniques. Same-origin techniques are safe by design because they are protected by the same origin policy, and cross-origin techniques require like really careful security checks, as we've seen in the post-message case. Also, post-message vulnerabilities seem to still be prevalent, also in single sign-on. And in single sign-on here, especially the sender side is like really important because it can result in token leakages. Okay, so also websites want a lot more flexibility, so they commonly implement single sign-on on their own, just like in the relay pop-up flow. And they also use relaxed post-message checks, like the regular expressions and the wildcards. So they use this to allow multiple domains or even subdomains to receive the post messages. And also there's a clear lack in the specification. So the pop-up flow and the IFrame flow are neither standardized nor formally described by the single sign-on working groups. And the post-message response mode should definitely be standardized, just like the form post response mode, which was also later added to the specification. Okay, so then I would like to end this talk with a quote from a specification which said that it is expected that additional response mode may be defined by other specifications in the future, including possibly ones utilizing the post-message API. So this might be a good idea. Okay, so thank you, and do you have any questions?